Welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm very honored to be able to speak to you, and I thank the embassy and the organizers for this event and for the invitation. So I will try to share with you some lessons coming from our experience as urban mobility optimizers, both in European and emerging countries and cities. First, I'll briefly present my company just to give you an understanding of where these lessons are coming from. Then I'll try to tell you a story from another emerging country through some of the main milestones, ups and downs that were experienced by Moroccan authorities over the last 10 years in their effort to cope and to improve urban mobility. And to conclude, I'll try to draw and highlight some tentative lessons in hope that some of them might be useful for you. About my company, or our company, Transitech is a Swiss consulting company specialized in urban mobility improvement. In brief, we are urban mobility optimizers, and we work at almost all levels, from policy, planning, engineering, design, governance, capacity building, research, etc. The only thing pretty much we do not do is construction, and for a clear reason is to keep our independence in the best advice we can provide. We have experience and references on all continents, but our main activities are in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Our company has a very long experience since it was funded in 1954. At a time where motorization rate in Switzerland was probably similar to most emerging countries today. And we are, just to finish on that, we're a strong team of about 100 professionals currently. So now about Morocco. Here you see some indications about this North African country that's just about 12 kilometers away from Europe. Morocco has several million inhabitant cities, the largest being Casablanca with about 5 million inhabitants, and Rabat, the second one, the capital city region, with about 2 million inhabitants. And the story I'm going to try to share with you starts about 10 years ago when in 2006 the head of the local government department of the Ministry of Interior, a department whose role is to support and supervise what is done by regional and municipal authorities, asked the World Bank for support. Support for three things. One, to assess urban mobility conditions in Moroccan cities. Two, to provide international benchmark. And three, to support the elaboration of a national policy for urban mobility. And that's how 10 years ago Transitech was commissioned by the World Bank to contribute to these efforts, along with in-house experts from the World Bank. And in brief, the situation we met at that point in Morocco was absence of any mass transit system, even in cities that were way beyond a million inhabitants already. Low performance bus lines operated by private companies. They were previously public companies, but they all had gone down by lack of investment and poor management. And a booming taxi industry, almost overwhelmingly booming, carrying far more passengers than buses, and making the majority of traffic flows. So obviously it came with that Moroccan cities were suffering from very rapidly increasing congestion, already very heavy in the two largest cities, fueled by increasing GDP. You saw earlier the GDP growth. You saw the car ownership was rising rapidly, also supported by low-cost private vehicles imported and arriving in the country. And with that came rising, of course, increasing road safety issues, increasing noise and air pollution issues, dropping urban quality, etc. So, in brief, unfortunately, a rather classic situation in emerging countries. And so what was wrong? What was to be fixed, and when and how and where to start? Well, so here in brief what we saw. What is quite interesting, of course, is that, as it is often the case, such problems very often have roots at governance level. We saw that the financial means that were allocated to urban transport were very low. So apart from road construction and some odd subsidies paid to private operators under not so transparent grounds basis, officially to compensate for lower student fares, the very low financial means. Weak institutional organization, ambiguous responsibility allocation between central and local government, inadequate human resource. Just for instance, and to illustrate this, in Casablanca, 5 million inhabitant city, one traffic management engineer who had graduated in another field, who didn't have an office space, who didn't have a car. We met in hotel lobbies, just to give you an idea. So not as much academic power as we can see in India through a conference like this. So, of course, low regulation, poor traffic management, weak enforcement, a bit of a theoretical planning, lack of vision, lack of leadership, no monitoring tools. So I will agree with you, quite a dark picture I'm drawing here. And so we worked quite extensively with the national levels, the local levels, all stakeholders for over a year. And by the end of 2007, we had a national policy for urban mobility ready that was officially adopted beginning of 2008 by the government. And it was structured around these 4 pillars, as you see here. First, provide, well, it's in another order. I start with the ground. First, provide reliable public transport services with high capacity services in larger cities, ensure adequate road space design and traffic management, 2 things that really have to go hand in hand. We'll maybe come back on it. Adequate institutions and capacities, and appropriate and sustainable financing. In brief, of course, there's a lot more to it in the details, and a specific law was drafted for urban mobility to better define and allocate responsibilities, provide funding, etc. And until that point, the process moved ahead rather swiftly. It took time, but it takes time to move, of course, a country forward. And so the process was rather swiftly advancing, thanks to the strong personal commitment, involvement, leadership of, I will say his name, Mr. Boutayeb, who used to be the head of the local government department. And the decision then took, the government took strong decisions between 2007, 2008, 2009. First, and this is sometimes useful, it's a kingdom. There's a king at the head of the state. And so when certain disputes are lasting for too long, there's a little advantage, at least that okay, a decision can come, and when the decision comes, there's no more discussion. In that field, the entire sector was placed under the supervision of the Ministry of Interior, which put an end to an unproductive competition with the Ministry of Transport. So that was a strong decision. Then in 2008, a law was passed to allow local municipalities to form joint authorities, namely encouraging them to plan and manage urban transport together, and allowing them to create joint asset agencies to implement joint projects. Other decisions was, of course, to implement mass transit systems, starting with the 2 largest cities. So in 2007, at the very end of the year, work started for a first LRT, tramway line in the capital city, Rabat, soon followed with another project, LRT project in Casablanca. In parallel, if I speak a bit about the capital city, in parallel in 2009, a new contract was passed with a private international renowned operator for the entire bus network. So the entire bus network of the capital city region started new, fresh in 2010 after an competitive tender for a 15-year-long net cost area contract with a fleet of 500, over 500 brand new buses. So things were happening, things were advancing. At least on the ground, the law was still was getting lost in discussions. Still today, the law is not passed for urban mobility in Morocco. Anyways, but things were advancing on the ground. At our level, at the level of our company, we ended up winning some tenders. The first urban mobility master plan in the country in Marrakesh. We won the first traffic management master plan in Casablanca. We helped design and implement a very big capacity building program. We were asked to elaborate guidelines for the design, urban road design and traffic management, and we ended up opening a permanent agency that we still have in Morocco and currently only with Moroccans that stayed with us for almost 10 years and who are now among the strongest capacity in the private sector in Morocco. And then within about 1 year, two successive events interrupted that kind of positive national dynamic. The first event, which was not really an event, it was an event for us, but really at first nobody really realized it ended up becoming an event. In the spring of 2010, Mr. Boutayeb, whom I mentioned earlier, was replaced as head of the local government department, as he was named chief director of the Ministry of Interior, which is one of the highest positions in the Moroccan administration. And so, with very large responsibilities, urban mobility reforms, obviously, and support were passed on into other hands, and the positive momentum, I would call it, was losing its main engine. But that we realized a bit later. The second event, which had much more direct and visible impacts, made headlines in the spring of 2011. The international bus operator, active in the capital city region, decided to drop out of its 15-year-long contract less than 2 years after initiating operations because of very heavy financial loss. So from one day to the next, here, we leave. And so really, literally from one day to the next, local authorities had no choice but to roll up their sleeve and learn how to operate a bus network. And this just 2 months before the launch of the brand new LRT line that was to be operated by another international operator on the basis of a 6-year gross cost contract, so another kind of contract. So of course, this was kind of a big bang. As you can imagine, in a capital city, when something like that happens. And both the local and the national government could not afford to leave a 2 million inhabitant city without bus services, obviously. So they quickly came together to find an emergency situation. So first, the main three impacted municipal governments jointly bought the bus company for a symbolic dirham, so it's, a few rupees. They took from the central administration a senior public officer and named him new director of the company. He had absolutely no previous experience in managing a transport company. And operations continued as well as possible with increasing financial deficits when the state-owned tramway line was brought into service in May 2010, which was about a year and a half ago before Casablanca. So these LRT lines were on very successful accomplishments on the engineering point of view and even with demand. But they were a burden on the financial scheme, let's say. And that's how Morocco found itself with urban transport clearly on top of the political agenda. On the one hand, with the positive dimension and popular success of the first two state-built and state-owned mass transit systems. And on the other hand, with poorly performing bus services, and, as I mentioned, this financial burden of a deficit-producing bus company in the capital region. And on the side, of course, still a booming taxi industry and still institutional capacities that still had to be improved, but that were supposed to keep everything under check. And so, obviously, mobility and accessibility in those cities was at stake. With this financial stress on the national budget, since only the national government was able to bear the deficits of the system. Also, we were with the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. And so the issues of urban mobility, again, became of national importance. And that's how the Mr. Boutayeb mentioned already twice earlier, now Chief Director of the Ministry of Interior, took the matter again in its own hands. In 2011, approximately, we were awarded the mission to redesign, restructure the public transport network in the capital city region, this time, of course, trying to integrate as well as possible the bus services, the LRT services. An important endeavor that's still ongoing today. Why so long? Well, first, because it was clear, both for the Ministry of Interior as for us, that this assignment had to be considered not just on the technical aspect, but also on the everything that goes around it. And so, again, a close collaboration with all stakeholders took place. The capital city region became a laboratory to identify solutions that would be optimal both for the specific context, but also to bring something new for the national system. And just to cite two of the main outcomes at this stage at national level, maybe I'll just come back on this in a second. The first outcome was that the central government clearly recognized that it was necessary for the national government to strongly contribute to financing urban transport. It was clear before on a theoretical level, but there suddenly it became extremely clear. And so based on an estimate we did that the needs for investments in mass transit systems throughout the main 10 cities in the country, a need that we estimated at about $3.6 billion US dollar. An agreement was concluded with the Ministry of Finance to ensure participation of the central government to about 70% of that amount through annual disbursements into a specifically dedicated fund. And the remaining 30% coming from cities. This mechanism came into force through the 2014 finance law. And of course, this new urban transport fund was placed under the responsibility of the chief director. Another big outcome of this was in parallel. So what you see here is more or less the institutional scheme for public transport services previously. And which led to this sort of crash of the system. And so an innovative institutional scheme was crafted to ensure strong partnership between central and local governments to favor development of strong capacities in transport planning, design, management, and to ensure clear responsibilities between the public hand and private operators, which is a PPP format, of course, with explicit and reasonable risk coverage. So what you see here is the scheme that was designed and that is now in place. And it's not just in place in Rabat. It's in place now in all projects that are being designed. It's this sort of idea that there is a public asset company with both participation from the national government and from local governments. So it's a private, let's say, it's private law, but it's public funds, which allows for very swift operations. That then awards contracts to the different operators with a revenue that is, we passed to we went from a net cost to a gross cost contract, and it's already proving to work rather well. We are still monitoring and seeing how this will unfold, but big outcomes already. And, well, actually, just 2 weeks ago, we were awarded a new assignment to help the government to define principles and rules on how to best use the National Urban Transport Fund. I mentioned to you the large amounts that are available. And should the available means be split and earmarked for each of the eligible city, who would then be asked to develop projects according to predefined budget, or should all eligible cities be put in competition and asked to submit their project, which should then be assessed according to predefined criteria? This is a bit what we're now working on with the government to try to help them move ahead there. We're also working currently on the first BRT project in North Africa, not on the engineering side, that's the easy part, but we are in charge of all the institutional, financial, and contractual aspects. Now, to move closer to some conclusions and after to some lessons, I just wanted to put this up. Everyone in urban transport planning somehow probably is aware of the Avoid, Shift, Improve policy framework. With whatever we can do to avoid additional unnecessary motorized transport. This is the avoid part. The shift is whatever we can do to have people on public transport or alternative modes, or keep them on public transport system, for instance. And the improve, how to improve the system really also in terms of efficiency. So this is a known framework. And we carried a study for the World Bank, African Development Bank, anyways, most of these institutions, at the entire continent level of Africa, with an enormous benchmark, etc. It's a very large study. And we ended up coming up with easy. We made from ASI, we went to easy. Why? Well, because the enabling dimension is, of course, key. And this is often something that is underlooked, mostly because there's engineering workings on it, and engineers like to work on the technical aspect. But very often what doesn't work is on the governance part. Anyways, I just wanted to point this out. Now, what lessons can we take and from that? And I'll just try to highlight a few. It's just very tentative. And also maybe make a link with our Swiss ness and say, why is being Swiss, how did it help? Well, first, don't satisfy yourself with copy-paste solutions. The failure of the bus transport operator in Morocco, it was sort of a copy-paste thing where, okay, this works well, for instance, in France, let's do it here. Well, the situation is very different. And in that case, it failed. So learn from mistakes, learn from others. This was said from earlier. And here comes the deal. A Swiss company, you know that Switzerland already is a small country, a small federal country, and it's composed of 26 fiercely independent states. With very different institutional setups. And so when you work as an urban transport consultant in Switzerland, and you constantly need to benchmark, you constantly need to compare, to analyze, there's never just a framework and you just work in that framework. So, and of course, rapidly, being a smaller country, you very rapidly end up working outside of the country, which is our case. More than 50% of our activities are abroad. So this is also in our DNA, to quote a previous speaker, no copy-paste, always seek tailor-made optimization. Another thing is that most urban mobility problems have roots at governance level, as we mentioned. You know that Switzerland has a very strong democracy, original institutional setup, and so there again, at governance level, you can be very creative, and I think Switzerland has something to show for that. I just need to mention that being Swiss, we're neutral, we're independent, we don't have a colonial past, and in a French-speaking country, in most French-speaking countries of Africa, the fact that we are French-speaking as well, but not French, helped a lot in general. To improve urban mobility, it takes dedication for general interest, it takes leadership, it takes time, it takes money. And I do think that Switzerland has a lot of brain power for that, a very strong sense for general interest and patience. So I will anyways, I will close on that, and I will thank you with this picture. You could think that the background is the beautiful Swiss Alps, as in the Bollywood movie, as it was mentioned. Well, actually, this is in Morocco, and I have to close on this because, of course, it's the city of Marrakesh, where the Conference of Parties, the 22nd COP, is taking place to fight for climate change. Clear link with what we're talking about here. Thank you very much for your attention.